In 1789, France was not just out of money, it was out of lies. At the height of the 18th century, it was the most powerful nation on earth, a hub of the Enlightenment, the center of global fashion, and a military superpower. But beneath the gold leaf of Versailles, the kingdom had become a ghost. For decades, its leaders had been borrowing against a future they could not afford, and maintaining a social hierarchy that the people no longer believed in. We often think of the French Revolution as a chaotic explosion of blood and madness, but when we treat history as a diagnostic tool, we see something much more precise, a repeating systemic failure. Today, we are analyzing the French Revolution as a diagnostic laboratory to understand the 4 signs that a society is about to hit the 9-meal rule, and why a strong man is always waiting at the end of the script. This analysis matters because we aren't just looking at the past, we are looking at the blueprints of power. There is a mechanical link between national debt, information silos, and the purity spirals that turn neighbors into enemies. Every civilization, no matter how advanced, is only 9 missed meals away from a total systemic reset. In late 18th century France, that reset began with a massive debt catalyst. The state had accumulated over 2 billion livres in debt, largely from funding overseas conflicts like the American Revolution to undermine their British rivals. But the system was structured in a way that made it impossible to collect the revenue needed to service that debt. The clergy and the nobility, who held the vast majority of the wealth and land, were virtually exempt from taxation. This created a condition of elite paralysis, where the Ancien Régime was fundamentally unable to reform itself because the elite's identity was tied to the very privileges causing the bankruptcy. The moment the trust bucket truly began to leak was when the Crown attempted to publish its finances for the first time. This demystified the state, turning what had been abstract grievances into concrete public knowledge of waste, corruption, and mismanagement. When the people realized that their sacrifices were subsidizing aristocratic luxury while they struggled to afford bread, the biological ticking clock began. By 1789, bad harvests had driven bread prices to a level where a single loaf cost 80% of a wage earner's budget. This is the bread threshold. History suggests that when people are hungry and the elite can no longer justify the myths of their authority, the civil layer of politics is stripped away, grounding the stakes in raw survival. However, hunger alone does not create a revolution. It requires an information accelerant. In the late 1700s, France saw a surge in underground literature and radical newspapers that functioned much like modern social media algorithms. Figures like Jean-Paul Marat and his paper L'Ami du Peuple created a culture of incendiary rhetoric and outrage loops. These pamphlets bypassed traditional institutional gatekeepers and reached an increasingly literate population, creating an atmosphere of constant paranoia and suspicion. The press did not just report the news, it opened up the possibility of thinking about the world differently, proving that the monarchy was not a divinely ordained necessity, but a failing system that could be replaced. This leads to a mechanism we call the elite squeeze. By the end of the century, France had produced too many educated, ambitious people, lawyers like Robespierre and Danton, without providing enough power slots for them within the existing hierarchy. These men possessed the intellectual tools of the Enlightenment, but were excluded from the corridors of power. When a system produces a surplus of elites it cannot absorb, those elites often find their only path to status is to burn the system down and create new slots for themselves. They weaponize to the language of equality and rights to dismantle the symbolic world of the monarchy. We see this dismantling through the lens of iconoclasm. The physical destruction of statues and royal symbols was not mindless vandalism, it was a sophisticated tool to unthink the leaders. When a mob decapitated a statue at the gates of Paris, they were signaling that the nation no longer recognized a single divinely ordained head. This shifted sovereignty from below. By removing the head of the body politic symbolically, the people were preparing themselves for the actual removal of the king. The destruction of the Bastille was the ultimate act of this kind, a strategic and symbolic strike against a fortress that represented royal despotism, which ignited the fuse of a new political order. Once the old order is liquidated, the system enters its most dangerous phase, the purity spiral. This is a process where the only remaining status symbol is moral purity or revolutionary zeal. Because there are no longer any traditional institutions to provide stability, safety is found only in being more radical than your neighbor. In this incentive structure, moderation is equated to treason. We see this in the transition from the moderate reform of the National Assembly to the radical extremism of the Jacobins. Individuals like Robespierre, who once opposed the death penalty, became the architects of the Reign of Terror because the logic of the spiral demanded constant purges to maintain power. The revolution inevitably began to devour its own children as the race for purity reached its lethal conclusion. The Reign of Terror, fueled by the guillotine, was presented as a rational and humane form of justice, yet it effectively made mass murder more efficient. By the summer of 1794, the Great Terror had reached such a tempo of executions that the system began to collapse under its own rigidity. The purity spiral eventually runs out of victims, and a weary population, exhausted by chaos, hunger, and paranoia, reaches a point where they are willing to trade their rights of man for a single man who can restore order. This is the strongman pivot. Chaos always creates a vacancy for a military dictator who promises stability over liberty. Napoleon Bonaparte was not an accident. He was the mechanical outcome of the revolution's failure to build stable, consensus-based institutions. He centralized power more effectively than the monarchy ever had, replacing democratic experiment with a modern dictatorship disguised as popular government. The French Revolution teaches us that when a system refuses to reform, it doesn't just break, it liquidates. The patterns of 1789, the elite squeeze, the outrage loops of pamphlet culture, and the emergence of purity spirals are not confined to the history books. They are the diagnostic markers of a society entering a phase of systemic collapse. The past is never truly dead. It is a recurring manual for the present. The question for us today isn't whether these mechanisms still exist, but where we currently sit on the timeline of the script.